All right. Good morning, Sanbonani, Molweni, Goeiemorgen, and all the other official languages. My name is Maangamu Tukulula. I am a human factors and ergonomics specialist and the managing director at Smart Ergonomics, and the host for this webinar. So we're just going to get started. I can see that people are still joining. At the moment, we have about 200 people that have joined us today. So thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so we can get the ball rolling. All right, I think we're ready to go. All right, so the title of our webinar today is called When Work Hurts, Musculoskeletal Disorders in Workplaces. And I think maybe to give you some context of why are we even doing this, before I give you an overview of the program, one of the things that we have started to see a lot while doing, risk assessments, doing occurrence investigations, reviewing safety management systems and the like, is that we're starting to notice that there are quite a lot of organizations who are not aware that musculoskeletal disorders are an issue. We're coming across a lot of instances when we do, prevalence surveys where a lot of workers are reporting that they're already experiencing some of these musculoskeletal disorders. When we review some of these risk assessments, we realize that when it comes to the identification of some of these musculoskeletal related risks, a lot of organizations are not able to either identify comprehensively or even quantify where the risks are and how big the issue is. And so based on this, experience, I then went and looked to see who I could bring on board who can participate in what we are in this webinar, where we're basically commemorating Ergonomics Month, as well as in this week, Back Care Awareness Week. And so I managed to get some of the leading experts in the field of occupational health medicine, legal matters, as well as ergonomics and biomechanics. And the idea behind this is to start sharing some of this information so that we can hopefully get people aware of what are the issues around musculoskeletal disorders, what are the legal issues, what's the issue when it comes to medical surveillance, why are these things not being measured, and then hopefully we can start getting these risks being managed in a more comprehensive way in industry. And so today's program is very brief. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, and so this is just a very brief overview of some of the most pertinent issues around musculoskeletal disorders. So I will start. I'll start the pack, and I'll basically go through some of the prevalence statistics and give you an overview of some of the effects of musculoskeletal disorders. After me will be Andrew Todd, who's a senior lecturer at Rhodes University in the Human Kinetics and Ergonomics Department. And he's basically going to be telling us in terms of the theory, the science behind what causes musculoskeletal disorders, because there are a lot of misconceptions in industry at the moment when it comes to this. And then we're going to hand over to George Khan, who's a senior associate at Richard Spoor Inc. And he's basically going to tell us the law around musculoskeletal diseases, because yes, the management of ergonomics, the management of musculoskeletal risks is legislated. A lot of people might not be aware of this, but it is legislated. So he'll take us through what are the legal requirements, as well as when it comes to the compensation of some of these musculoskeletal disorders. He'll give us an overview of what's happening there as well. After that, we're going to have Dr. Millicent Tlakula, who's a medical practitioner at OSHAC Health and Safety Solutions. And she's going to basically give us an idea of how do they currently diagnose MSDs, what are the challenges or limitations around that, and then also talk about medical surveillance, because of course, when it comes to the legislation, medical surveillance is one of the requirements that organizations need to comply with. And so she'll take us through what does that mean, what would it look like, and some of the challenges, I think, in practice that are being experienced there. We're then going to very briefly look at some of the discuss some of the gaps in the management of MSDs in South Africa, and the Q&A session will be basically part of that session. So please use the chat function to already ask some of the questions that you might have. And then just very briefly, I'm just going to take you through some of the statistics that we have available. So before we get into the statistics, what are musculoskeletal conditions and disorders? So basically, there's about more than 150 different musculoskeletal disorders that have been documented. Some of these are acute, some of these are chronic in nature. And basically, these are all these conditions that affect the locomotor system, so your musculoskeletal system, which would include your muscles, tendons, bones, ligaments, discs, blood vessels, nerve, etc. And what we know based on the evidence that's available as presented by the WHO is that musculoskeletal disorders are the highest contributor to the global need for rehabilitation. Almost 2/3 of all adults who need rehabilitation, it's because of musculoskeletal disorders. And in terms of the impact, we know that through evidence that one of the main reasons in terms of workers having activity limitations and even premature exit out of the workforce are because of MSDs in workplaces. We also know that people are starting to get absent more and more from work because of MSDs, and that obviously will have an impact in terms of productivity losses. We also know that there are a significant mental health decline and deteriorated function when it comes to that, because people are affected not only physically, but also from a psychological perspective. And we also have seen in developed nations that the cost of compensation is so high. In South Africa, do we really know what the cost of compensation related to musculoskeletal disorders is? Possibly we have an idea from the COVID related claims. However, because of there's a lot of underreporting, because of a lot of other issues, I would argue that we actually do not know the true cost of compensation. We actually don't know the true cost of these musculoskeletal disorders. In the available statistics from the Compensation Fund reports, we can see that there is an increase in the number of claims that are being paid out. Unfortunately, they currently do not, and that's a hint if any of the compensation personnel or the Department of Labor personnel are here. That information is currently not broken down, so we actually don't know publicly, that is, what the actual compensation-related costs are for musculoskeletal disorders. And so, when before we get into the next thing, I would like all of us to please participate in a poll. The first poll, I will publish it in a second. The poll is asking you to please indicate if in the last 12 months, so in the last year, if you have experienced any pain, discomfort, aches, or swelling in any part of your body while you're performing your duties. And if that is the case, there's a couple of options. You can say, yes, it's mostly in the lower back. Yes, mostly in the upper back, mostly in your wrist, in your neck, in your shoulders, hips, buttocks, knees, feet, or multiple areas. So you can choose the I option, or you can say, no, actually, I haven't had any of these issues. Or you can say, I'm actually not sure if I've experienced this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to publish the poll now. And then can you please then vote while we continue with the presentation? Let me just publish the poll. All right, please vote in the poll while we continue with the presentation. Okay, so why should we be paying attention to MSDs? So firstly, we know from the WHO that approximately 1.7 billion people suffer from musculoskeletal disorders, and that's globally. And this is based on the global burden of disease statistics. And of these, lower back pain seems to be the main contributor to this burden of disease. And basically, lower back pain is basically pain and discomfort in the lumbar region of the spine. So that's by that the small of your back, of your lower back. And based on statistics from from Morris et al. In 2018, they basically reported that the lower back pain was the 6th highest burden in a list of 291 conditions, and it was the cause of more years lived with disability globally compared to other diseases. Of course, these statistics are a bit old, so we don't know at the moment what the situation is, especially with COVID, where people were actually exposed to more of these musculoskeletal risk factors than before. We're going to end the poll now, and I'm hoping that we have had a lot of people voting. We're going to end the poll so that we can see what the results look like. So far, we've had, from the audience, we've had 28% of you saying that mostly in your lower back, you've had in the last year some kind of pain, discomfort, swelling, followed by 8% saying, followed by about 17% saying yes in multiple body areas in your body. And then 12% of you are saying no, you haven't had any experiences. And about 8% are saying mostly in your upper back, 6% in your neck, and 4% are saying in your wrists you've had in the last year some kind of issues when it comes to pain, discomfort, swelling in various parts of your body. So that's quite high. That's quite high for some of the areas. And of course, as I've indicated, lower back is one of the highest when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders. And these statistics that you, through the poll, support this. Okay, and then we're going to have a second poll that I will run very quickly. And then this one is asking you in the last week. So now we're not talking in the last year. In the last week, how often did you experience any pain, discomfort, aches, or swelling? And then you must please cast your vote. I'm just going to start that poll now while we continue with the presentation. Thank you for participating, by the way. All right, we're going to start the next poll right now while we continue with the presentation very quickly. Okay, we're going to end the poll a little bit later. To give you some of the prevalence statistics, when it comes to lower back pain prevalence in Africa, if you look at lifetime prevalence, so studies that have looked at lifetime prevalence, 47% has been quoted as the number of people who are affected by musculoskeletal disorders. If we're looking at annual prevalence, so people who have experienced musculoskeletal disorders in the last 6 to 12 months, there was a prevalence rate of 57%. And then point prevalence are those studies which said right now, as we're doing the study, how many people are experiencing lower back pain. And essentially that was 39%. So if you look at these statistics, in the African continent, our prevalence rates suggest that we are suffering the most compared to the other developed nations or globally when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders and specifically lower back pain. And if we look at the industries where these statistics are coming from, it's healthcare, it's construction, it's agriculture, it's service industries, it's sports, it's manufacturing, it's mining, it's transport, it's education. So essentially, because we know that musculoskeletal disorders can affect everyone, I think this is also testament to the fact that even with the different industries on the continent, almost all industries are affected. And what's really, really concerning is that even from like really, really young ages, so from school going years to university, already some of these people are already having these issues. I'm going to stop the poll. Oh no, I didn't even publish it. Okay. Please can you vote in the poll, and we'll continue with the presentation very quickly. And so if we look at some of the South African statistics very quickly as we move on, we know, for example, that in under coal mining, in a study that was done there, the rates were 24%, 25% prevalence of musculoskeletal disorders. Long distance drivers, 22% prevalence. Computer users and workers, 76% prevalence. In people that were basically in I think these were also office kind of workers in a South African study that had over 15,000 people participating. The rates there were 47%. And then also, if you look at a recent study by Nyantumbu Mkize for her PhD, her prevalence statistics were about 84% for hospital nurses, and for bank workers around 76%. And even in the construction industry, Smallwood, Deakin et al., basically they're reporting 78% prevalence. So this is an issue. Whether or not organizations are aware of the prevalence rate within their organizations is another question that we will need to answer. But in any case, we're going to end the poll now. And basically, the poll is saying 62% of you, just last week, 62% of you were experiencing some kind of musculoskeletal discomfort at least once or 2 times a week. 13% 3 to 4 times a week, and then 10% are saying once every day last week you were experiencing some pain, discomfort, and swelling, and then others 13% are saying several times every day you are already experiencing this. So these statistics are quite alarming, but we'll get into why are you possibly affected in these ways. All right. And then we're going to go to the next poll, which is asking you if you've experienced this pain, discomfort, or aches or swelling, has it interfered with your ability to do your work? Please vote very quickly because we're going to end the poll just now. So has it affected your ability to do your work? And the options that you have here are not at all, you were slightly affected, you were substantially affected, or you haven't experienced any of these symptoms. Okay, we're going to please vote very quickly in the next 2 seconds. We're going to end the poll, and people are still voting. Okay, we're going to need to end the poll because of time. And the statistics so far are saying 31% are saying not at all. 61% of you are saying that you are slightly affected. So the pain, discomfort, and swelling, the musculoskeletal issues slightly affected your ability to do your work. 2% are saying you are substantially affected, and 4% are saying you are not affected at all. So that's also quite revealing, I would say. All right, and then we're going to move on with the presentation. And then the next poll, and this is important because we suspect that there's a huge underreporting of musculoskeletal disorders. So if you have experienced any of these symptoms, did you report it to your employer? Please, can you cast your vote as we move on with the rest of the presentation? So basically, why should we pay attention to MSDs as you continue to vote? Firstly, available evidence suggests that there's a prevalence rate, there's high prevalence rates across different industries, even in South Africa. And musculoskeletal disorders are currently arguably not being prioritized in developing nations as they are in the developing world. And there are lots of reasons for this. Mainly, there are other pressing health, socioeconomic issues, so HIV, AIDS, poverty issues, and now recently with COVID-19, these are more pressing issues. And because MSDs are not regarded as life-threatening, they're going to get pushed down the list. And unfortunately, these are already having a huge health burden on our people. And then the actual prevalence rates, I think we don't actually know. A lot of organizations have not even asked their people through their medical surveillance programs. They're not even checking if musculoskeletal disorders are an issue. And even across industries, we actually don't know what's happening. And across the country, we actually don't have, the statistics to tell us what are the issues. And also, I think Dr. Millie will probably touch on this, there's probably a low success rate when it comes to compensation claims. And so if it's going to take too much time, people are not going to, claim for these. And then also the true cost of these is actually not known, and awareness is low, and this is part of the reason why we are doing these polls. I mean, while we are doing these awareness sessions. Someone just told me that I didn't actually publish the poll. My apologies for that. Please, can you vote in that? So the question is, have you? My apologies. I've published the wrong poll. I will get you to vote in the right poll right now, which is saying that did you report any of these issues to your employer if you are already experiencing musculoskeletal issues? I'm going to publish the poll now so that you can start voting. And while you do that, we'll end the poll a little bit later. I would like to now just give you a few minutes to vote in that poll so that I can start introducing Andrew in a minute. So please vote in the poll. Joe, so many people are voting. Joe, the numbers are the numbers are going crazy. Okay, please, can you vote? Just one more, maybe a few more seconds, and then we will we'll show you the results. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and let's see. So, Joe, this is interesting. So the question was, if you've experienced any of these musculoskeletal issues, have you reported them to your employer? And 40% of you are saying no, you did not think it was a reportable issue. 15% are saying you don't think it's a serious enough issue. 14% are saying you don't think your employer could assist you even if you reported it. And encouragingly, 3% are saying you've reported and you were assisted. And 4% are saying nothing was done even though you reported. And then 20% of you are saying that you haven't even experienced these issues. So I think this is, giving us an idea of some of the issues that we are experiencing when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders. But I will now hand over to some of our experts who are going to tell us exactly what are the issues, what are the causal factors when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders. And our first speaker, as he starts sharing his presentation and turning on his camera, is Andrew Todd. And Andrew is a senior lecturer at Rhodes University in the Department of Human Kinetics and Ergonomics, where he has taught for the past 18 years. And I'm one of the products of that teaching, by the way. Andrew is passionate about all things human factors and ergonomics and is dedicated to promoting the profession and the ultimate goals of human factors and ergonomics. To this end, he has served as the president of the Ergonomics Society of South Africa, of Ergo Africa, which is the network of African ergonomic societies, as well as 2 terms as the chair of the International Ergonomics Association Standing Committee for International Development. So he's got quite a huge presence locally as well as internationally. He's currently serving as the chair of the Strategic Development for International Ergonomics Association, as well as the treasurer of the Ergonomics Society of South Africa. He lectures biomechanics and systems in the Human Kinetics and Ergonomics department and is interested in understanding the complexity of human performance in both the formal and the informal economy. All right. Thank you so much to Andrew for your time and for the insights that you're going to be sharing with us now. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sma, and firstly, thank you to you for organizing this really interesting session for us. And I think you have really put an interesting group of people together, and I think we need to be doing this more often, where we are looking at things like musculoskeletal disorders from a multidisciplinary perspective, because it's definitely the way forward in terms of how we come up with solutions. I'm going to premise my talk primarily around low back pain. And I think Sma did a really good job of motivating for why that should be the case in terms of the sheer volume of people that suffer from low back pain at any point in time. And you saw from your own poll that low back pain was the most prevalent of all the issues that we have. And so I'm going to primarily focus around a human factors and ergonomics approach to understanding lower back pain. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do 2 parts to the talk. I'm going to start by looking at what the traditional approaches have been, and that those have primarily been focused on a physical characteristics perspective from a biomechanical and physiological perspective, and trying to come up with guidelines for the protection of the back using biomechanical and physiological data. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what are the latest approaches and show how we are starting to recognize the need for a far more systemic approach that embraces the idea of complexity and the complex interaction of factors that actually contribute to the development of disorders, and show you some ideas on where I think we need to be going with that. It is a challenge in the very short amount of time I have got available, so let's see how we go. So in terms of the traditional approaches, these were, as I said, primarily physical in nature, and they were based upon this idea of biomechanical logic. And biomechanical logic looks at the idea of, can we look at and come up with an idea of how much exposure is too much exposure? And we do that, and we answer that question using what we would refer to as the load tolerance relationship. And I'll give you a little bit more detail on that in one of the slides coming up. And through the load tolerance relationship, what we can do is design a safety margin into the system. If we know what load you are being exposed to, and we know what the tolerance is, we can design a safety margin and therefore protect people in their work and stop the prevalence of low back pain in the work environment. So how this works is really pretty simple. The first thing we do is we determine task demands. So we can look at someone performing their task, and we can use biomechanics in order to understand the compression and shear forces and torsional forces that are acting on L5S1 over here, and through that come up with a quantification and understanding of what the loading pattern is that is occurring on the lower back. Why the focus on L5S1? It is because where most of the injuries occurs, where most of the discomfort occurs. So there's some rationale behind focusing on L5S1, and we get here a good idea of what are the demands that we are being exposed to from a biomechanics perspective. The second step then is to go, well, what is the tolerance of the intervertebral disc here at L5S1? How much compression can it withstand? How much shear force can it withstand? And through this, the outcome that we get is a quantification of what the tissues can withstand. So now we have both the quantification, understanding of what the loading pattern is, and we have an understanding of what the tissues can withstand. We use this to model using the load tolerance relationship, and here we have it. We have an understanding of what the load is that you're being exposed to and what that loading pattern is. We have an understanding of what the tolerance is, and we can design a safety margin in there, and we can protect workers from exposure to work that has excessive demands being placed on them, and the MSD problem is solved. This is the traditional way. But clearly what we have seen over the last 2 decades after the implementation of the strategy is that it hasn't worked. Simple biomechanical logic of determining here are the task demands, and you've probably all heard the 3,400 newtons as the magical number that came out of NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in the US, that the tolerance is 3,400 newtons, and as long as you keep the work demands below that, it's going to be safe and we're not going to have excessive exposure. We would expect after the implementation of these that we would see a significant drop in the number of musculoskeletal disorders, but unfortunately that hasn't been the case, and in fact, the opposite has probably happened. So what we've then done is take these models and say, okay, well, maybe these simple biomechanical models are too simple and we need to add a biological or physiological component to them as well and look at it in a little bit more detail. And so what we've done then is we said, okay, well, we can't look at the body as a whole. We need to look at the joint at the tissue level, and not only just at the tissue level, also at the matrix within the intervertebral disc, at a cellular level within the intervertebral disc, and really try and understand what is happening there. In order to do that, we need to start to understand the relationships in a little bit more detail. So the load, and that the load is going to be dependent upon the arrangement of the work procedures, temporal exposure factors on the equipment, the environment, etc. And that what we get then is we get a tissue response. We get a response within the intervertebral disc. And this response leads to an outcome. And this outcome is either adaptation or symptoms, impairment, and disability leading through that process. Now we need to start to understand, well, how do we ensure that we get adaptation? Well, that's actually pretty simple. We can start to understand when we get exposure to a load, there is tissue breakdown. We then need to focus not only on that response from a tissue breakdown perspective, but also what happens afterwards, the repair process. In response to tissue breakdown, we get tissue buildup, right? And I don't have the luxury of the time to explain that in detail here now. If we have appropriate recovery, we have appropriate rest, we will get tissue breakdown and you get tissue buildup. And when those are the same, we get the maintenance of the tissue. There is neither symptoms nor adaptation. The tissue stays as it was. However, if the tissue buildup is less than the tissue breakdown, so for example, there's not adequate sleep, there's not adequate nutrition, those sorts of factors, we get tissue breakdown, and this is where it leads to symptoms, impairment, and disability, obviously something that we don't want. So what we actually need to ensure is that we have tissue breakdown that is less than the tissue buildup. And in this case, we get adaptation that occurs. We've had sufficient sleep, we've had sufficient rest, we've had sufficient nutrition, all of those factors leading to actually the tissue buildup after the exposure is better, and we have adaptation, and in fact, the tolerance limit goes up rather than coming down. If that is the case, we need to then start to think about in a little bit more detail the complexity of all of these factors interacting with each other. And what we've realized is that tolerance limits are not static, like you saw in that previous diagram. In fact, tolerance limits are dynamic, and there are a variety of factors that are going to influence the tolerance limits. Strength and conditioning may improve it. Genetic factors may suddenly drop it. Age, it slowly decreases. Cumulative exposures, it slowly decreases. So in fact, when we try and start to understand tolerance limits, they actually look a little bit more like this. Here we have different individuals. You have an individual down here who has no pre-existing biological risk factors. Up here, we have someone who has existing biological risk factors. What that does is it means you have two different individuals who will respond to the same task in very different ways. On top of that, what this is showing us is that actually we can have different individuals and the exposure to the workload. If the workload is too low, in other words, physical intensity is low, risk of injury goes up. So there's an optimal exposure that we need to try and focus on. And so what this then leads us to is that this should be a response that is individual based. Okay, so now we don't have just a 3,400 Newton limit. We need to understand this in a little bit more detail. We need to understand pre-existing biological risk factors, and voila, the problem is solved. But again, unfortunately, what we have seen that even this sort of response is not sufficient. Just understanding physiological, biological, and biomechanical factors hasn't been able to reduce the impact of musculoskeletal disorders. And that takes us now to an HFE systems approach, because there's something very important in this diagram when I showed it to you earlier, when we think about the load and the tissue response and the outcome, that in fact, there is something missing from the diagram. And that is that the load, the tissue response, and the outcome are dependent upon greater number of factors that are organizational, individual, and social in their characteristics. What this is actually suggesting, the latest models to understanding the development of low back pain, not only in the workplace, but more generally, are biopsychosocial. They are biological factors, they are social factors, and they are psychological factors that all interact to lead to the outcomes. And we need to understand that in much more detail. And so if we want to understand this biological response in more detail, we need models to be able to do so. And so what we realize here is that at a micro scale, at the intervertebral disc, there is macro dependence upon the context within which performance is occurring, and we need to embrace that and understand that. What this suggests is the following. We are suggesting here that when we are doing a task like a lifting task, a pushing or pulling task, we're sitting at the desk, doesn't matter what the task is. There is a physical environment and there are physical demands. But every task, even if it is a primarily physical task, has cognitive and psychosocial aspects to it. And so there are cognitive demands associated with the lifting task, and that task occurs within a psychosocial work environment. And that it is the interaction of all four of these, the physical, the psychosocial, and cognitive, that determine the perception of the task demands. And it is the perception of the task demands that is interpreted by the individual, not the task demands from a purely physical perspective. It is more complex than that. The task that is interpreted is based upon the perceptions, which are based upon both physical and psychosocial and cognitive factors. And so if we take this and we now extend it when we look at this task interpretation in a little bit more detail, the way in which a task is interpreted is based upon your perceptions of that task. And then how you actually perform the task is dependent upon previous experiences of that task, your genetics and predispositions, your personality type, the current biochemical relationship or the biochemical status of the body. What is the current inflammation state? How much sleep have you had? What's the nutrition status? All of those factors are taken into account by the brain, and the decision that is then made is dependent upon your perception of the task. And therefore, the muscle activation, the magnitude of how much muscle force is exerted, the sequence of muscles being coordinated is all dependent upon this multitude of complex factors. And it is this multitude of complex factors that leads to the task performance. And so if we want to understand it, it is far more complex and far more difficult than just taking a biomechanical approach. We need to understand it more systemically. And so what this is suggesting, in fact, is that the psychosocial work environment has an important role to play in the development of musculoskeletal disorders. So in a work environment that has low social support, it has high job demands, you have low control over the work that you're doing, and you have low job satisfaction, has an impact actually on the biomechanical load at work. The biomechanical load is not just dependent upon the weight of the box that you're lifting. It's not just dependent upon how high you're lifting it from. It is also dependent upon the psychosocial work environment. The psychosocial work environment leads to psychological stress or strain, which leads to changes in the biochemical and biological processes at a physiological level. So there is physiological dependence upon the psychosocial work environment. And so the demands and the perceptions of the task are dependent upon these factors. And therefore, the muscle response, there's increased tension when there's increased psychosocial stress within a work environment, decreased supply of blood to the extremities. All of these factors and long-term stress lead to the development of musculoskeletal disorders, coupled with the physical strain from the biomechanical workload. And so if we truly want to understand a work environment, we need to understand the complexity of that work environment. And so if you want to understand the risks of developing a problem, we need to understand interaction between humans, the tools and technology, the tasks, the organization, and the internal environment, as well as the external environment, and the processes that are in place in order to guide these interactions that lead to the outcomes of either human well-being and productivity in the workplace, or to musculoskeletal disorders and the lack of productivity. So I guess what I'm really getting at here, to close off with one slide, is that if we want to understand the development of musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace, and we want to understand why is the prevalence of low back pain so high, we need to understand what people do, how people do it, where they do it, and who they actually are. And it is through this complex understanding of the interactions between these various factors that we'll start to be able to solve musculoskeletal disorders within the workplace, embracing the biopsychosocial nature of musculoskeletal disorders. That is all from me. Thank you very much. I think I just about kept to time, Smith.
Andrew, you were perfect when it comes to time. Thank you so much. What a really, really, really insightful presentation. I think you really managed to, break down something that is really technical and very scientific and make it easy for people to understand. There were already quite a few questions here, but we're going to keep them for the end. Thank you so much for your presentation, Andrew. I would like to invite George Khan to please start sharing his slides and opening his camera and his mic. And while he does that, I would like to introduce George. By the way, George and I have never met. I've been following him on LinkedIn, and I was really interested in the Silicosis Class Action Act that he's leading. And the reason why I was really intrigued by that is to try and understand the impact of organizations or even industries not managing some of these occupational risk factors, and then decades later these things are coming up as class action acts. So that's how I got to start stalking George. But in any case, he agreed to be a part of this this session as well, which I'm really grateful for. And just to introduce who George is a public interest lawyer at Richard Spoor Inc. Attorneys, and he has been practicing law for more than a decade in the arena of industrial human rights law. Khan has been involved in numerous far-reaching court cases involving workers' health and safety rights and their compensation aspects, including the silicosis class action against the gold mining companies and several leading cases on interpretation of the mining and non-mining occupational health and safety legislation. Khan is involved in statutory and non-statutory compensation disputes on behalf of injured or sick workers under the Compensation of Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, the Occupational Diseases in Mines and Works Act, and common law. Khan is presently updating Prof. Benjamin Jutter's commentary for the COIDA and is frequently appears before COIDA Compensation Court on behalf of workers. He's advised numerous unions, institutes, companies, health trusts, NGOs, government departments, the Medical Bureau of Occupational Diseases, and the National Institute of Occupational Health. And now this audience that we have today. Khan read towards his science, humanities, and legal studies at UCT, Rhodes, Wits, and Wits. And he's the son of Dr. Red Khan, who's a practicing occupational medical practitioner and a certified independent medical examiner who's based in the heart of gold mining industry in Welkom, Free State. He's principally based between RSI, White River, and Parktown offices. George, thank you so much for agreeing to be a parent. We really look forward to slides, and we're hoping that the questions that will come will be able to cover as many as possible. Already in the chat function, people are asking, how do you know if it's compensable because it was exposure from work or exposure from home. So I think you'll probably assist us from a legal perspective to try and understand how do you battle it out in court when it comes to proving if it's work or home related risk factors that contributed. But thank you so much. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for inviting me to come and present to you. It's a real honor and a privilege. Just in terms of the process forward, I'm going to be a little bit unorthodox and work backwards. So I'm going to start with what we do once we have a situation with this. And then I'm going to walk backwards towards how do we deal with in terms of preventing it. I've already showed the brief agenda and some abbreviations. I am going to fly very quickly through these slides, unfortunately, because I don't have very much time, but I'm hoping that there will be a further discussion about all these issues during the discussion process, and these slides will be shared with everybody. And I just want to point out that the links in them will be made active as well, so a person can click on the link and it'll take you to the source documentation that you can see where what I'm saying comes from and so forth like that. Then if we can just proceed and begin. What we're basically talking about when we talk about workman's compensation is we talk about the COIDA, or what some people refer to as the Workmen's Compensation old act and legislation. What is important to understand about that is that COIDA grants employers immunity against an employee actually suing them when they encounter one of these kinds of conditions. They are not allowed to sue. However, and this is what we refer to by the Constitutional Court in its judgment that looked at this issue, is we refer to the great compromise that occurs. An employee doesn't have to demonstrate negligence on behalf of the employer, but on the flip side of that, the employee is then guaranteed to some sort of compensation, whether it's medical assistance for the costs, whether it's potentially even a pension or a lump sum payment for the harm that they've incurred. And our Constitutional Court has said that that is constitutional. It is fair because of the great compromise that happens. What I do, however, need to point out is that immunity is not absolute. There are loopholes to it. So, and I frequently you exercise those loopholes, and those loopholes might exist where the type of work being done is not ordinarily connected with the work that was done at the time that resulted in the injury. The key example of that in our courts at the moment was a municipal worker who was injured and traumatized during a riot at a municipal council, and they said, well, although she works at a municipality, that is not part of her normal job description, and therefore if she incurs that kind of issue that doesn't fall under COIDA, she's permitted to sue. Similarly, and this is quite problematic for a lot of employers, is contractors. Labor brokers, any employee that's not directly employed by the employer is actually able to sue the company in addition to claiming their workman's compensation fund. So they actually get the benefit of the COIDA, and they can still sue the company that's employing them as a principal employer for their general damages or whatever else. And obviously a DIMWA, but that's not relevant for our purposes. That's more relating to the class action we had against the gold mines. What I do, however, just want to point out is when we go outside the immunity, and this is maybe where it's a little bit controversial relating to the Constitutional Court judgment I mentioned earlier, is that I don't need, as a lawyer, to prove negligence in every case. There are infrequent instances where I can rely on strict liability, which means it doesn't matter who's to blame. All that matters is, did the harm manifest from the work that they were doing for the employer? And we actually, in fact, have several court judgments on this already. So it's not something that is completely unknown to our laws, what many other lawyers might suggest to you. It is actually something that does exist in our law presently. What I just need to also understand and explain is that COIDA distinguishes between injuries, which is traumatic events, and diseases. And what is important to understand there, and it's very nicely emphasized in the Van Zyl matter, which dealt with a gentleman that was being exposed to sort of a gaseous environment. And what the court explained and referred to in the judgment that the doctor had identified was that the accident essentially didn't stop happening. It kept on ongoing happening. And essentially that's where we then draw the line between a disease and an injury. A very good example of this, however, is also in the PTSD scenario, where the circular that presently exists seems to suggest that PTSD is an injury, whereas our courts have accepted and they've recognized that that is actually not correct. PTSD is a disease because it is often manifest from something that doesn't happen once off. It happens on an ongoing basis and gets progressively worse. In this regard, what is very important to all practitioners and HR people to understand is the circulars that are frequently indicated by the Compensation Commissioner and RAND Neutral and FEMA as being the be-all and end-all. Those circulars are not law. What is important to understand is the doctors, where the doctor says that the circular is inconsistent with their appreciation of the actual impairment and disability, the doctor's voice is going to carry the most weight. And then it becomes very important to understand who are these qualified medical doctors or health practitioners that can say these sorts of things. And it's very important to understand that the legislation is very clear on who's allowed to make these types of assessments and who's not. So presently, under the new amendment that is going to go through soon, it's been passed by Parliament, the President just needs to sign it. Once that goes through, a chiropractor, for example, will not be able to give this kind of medical advice anymore. But as soon as you have a medical practitioner that says that this is a very serious issue, despite what the circular may say, provided that the doctor is at least consistent with the Act, the doctor's voice will carry the most weight, and the circular, to a certain extent, will be departed from. What I need to explain and understand is that what we're talking about when we talk about COIDA is not just sort of workman's compensation. In actual fact, has a constitutional flavor to it as well, meaning that it is a constitutional right, just as your right to human dignity and life remains. And because of that, it's something that has the constitutional spirit in the sense that it can't prescribe. So if you had an injury way back in the past and you did report it to the employer, but the employer, for whatever reason, failed to report it to the compensation commissioner, that claim does not actually prescribe. Okay, and this is somewhat controversial because the Act itself seems to reference a prescription element, but you need to understand, so long as you, the employee, have reported it to the employer, and the employer is the one that's failed to report it to the compensation commissioner, that claim remains alive. And that claim can be actually submitted even decades later. Obviously, that makes it a lot more difficult to work out what's going on, but that still remains the case. And what the claim includes is that you are entitled to your medical expenses relating to this issue. You're related to potentially some medical, some financial expenses. So you might even qualify for a pension or a lump sum payment. And in exceptionally complicated and severe cases, you might even benefit from a constant care allowance if you can't actually look after yourself because of the disease. What is important to understand, and I think this is where most people get this wrong, is that if you have one of these conditions and the doctor diagnoses you with one of these conditions and you work in a workplace where you are exposed to particular risks. So, for example, I had an electrician earlier this week who works in frequently an awkward kind of position trying to get to the wiring. We, as lawyers, and in terms of the COIDA, don't actually go into the whole question about what did A cause B. What we actually say is, well, there's a presumption that kicks in terms of the legislation. It basically says, if you have this condition, and we know from people like Andrew's presented before that this condition can be work-related if you work in a particular kind of environment where you have awkward positions or vibration, that sort of thing, we are going to assume that it is actual occupational, and we therefore assume that it is reportable. Okay, it then becomes the employer's responsibility, or Rand Mutual, or the compensation funds, or whoever, to actually rebut that presumption, which is possible. They would need to call an expert to testify to that, but essentially we start off by saying, if you work with typing and so forth like that, and you get carpal tunnel syndrome, or whatever the story is, we assume that the carpal tunnel is related to the typing exercises and so forth like that. And what is important to understand is, if an employer fails to report this to the compensation commissioner, it actually at the present moment is a criminal offense. The new amendment, once it comes into law, is going to change the position slightly, and it'll then become an issue where they can be fined and penalized, but it's no longer criminal. But the point is that the employer doesn't get to decide whether it is occupational or not. It's actually with the occupational commissioner, the compensation commissioner and mutual, that get to make that determination. The employer can be absolutely of the view that it's not, but they have to report it, and that's the way it works. What I do also just want to point out is, I've provided to you on the previous list a list of the so-called presumptions where the presumption kicks in. What is important to understand is the international convention that deals with these kinds of things, and the presumption I refer to has actually been updated in 2010. Our legislation hasn't yet taken into account that update. We tend to be normally a few decades behind the rest of the world in that regard. But presently, the new list of the so-called presumptions is actually far more extensive, as you can see on your screen here, and basically indicates that the moment you have one of these diseases that's diagnosed by any doctor or health practitioner, and you presumably work with this type of scenario, it's automatically going to be occupational and must be reported and potentially compensatable. What is then important to understand is, how do you assess it? So you've got this occupational thing. What does that mean? How bad is it? Now, I do want to point out, although I haven't highlighted it here, there is a circular 180 which deals with this particular kind of thing. I haven't referred to it, and the reason why I don't do that is because I don't think it's particularly helpful. And what it does, in fact, is it refers to the circular that is listed here, which is 157, which basically indicates sort of what I sometimes describe to, and the court sometimes describe to, as a meat chart, where they're trying to assess if you can't move this part of your body, or if you lost a certain amount of motion because of the issue, what is that worth in terms of compensatory values? The golden number in terms of the COIDA is 30%, because if you're above 30% permanently disabled, based on these circulars and based on the Act, you then become entitled to a pension. Less than 30%, it's a lump sum story. And what's important to understand is even Circular 157, as I've repeated and I've stated before, is that it's not law. So a doctor can come along and say, yes, they've looked at 157. However, 157 doesn't deal with this specific kind of scenario that we're talking about here, or it's more serious. And what they can then do is refer to the Schedule 2, which is in the Act, which is actually more definitive. So you might find that the doctor says he agrees with Schedule 2 and he thinks it's a certain percentage, but Schedule 157 says it's something less. It's going to be the doctor's opinion aligned with Schedule 2 that's going to take precedence, and that's very important to understand. The circulars are not the be-all and end-all. You can depart from them where the doctors motivate them. What is important to also understand with compensation is, as I've indicated to you previously, if it's not reported, it doesn't go away. But that said, even if it is reported and it isn't actually that bad at that stage, I understand from the doctors that the back conditions tend to get progressively worse and worse over years. So it may be fairly trivial in the beginning. It might be only worth a 5% permanent disability, but later in life it might get more complicated, that additional back surgeries might be required, and it might actually be quite disabling. Beyond the 30% golden figure. In that regard, what's important to understand is the COIDA allows you to reopen any kind of closed case when there is new medical information available. So if a doctor comes and says, that was fine back then, but there's now the circumstances have changed, you're entitled to reopen it, and you can do that right up until the day you die. So you may have already been retired. You may have reached 65 and your back condition now has gotten really bad that you can't do ordinary things. You can still approach the Compensation Commission under the relevant section, Section 90, request that the matter be reconsidered, and whether or not the compensation fund will then pay for your back surgery the doctor might be asking you to have. What is important to understand with the Compensation Commissioner, workmen's compensation, is as a constitutional right, the door is never closed, as the High Court has indicated in the judgment that I've referenced below. Then go into the whole issue in terms of what do you do in order to avoid these compensatory issues. It's either going to go through the COIDA, or potentially you might end up actually being sued by a lawyer because you might fall into one of those loopholes and you may have in fact breached a regulation. We need to look at the actual regulations themselves. What is important to understand, and this is true for both the mining sector under the Mine Health and Safety Act as well as the non-mining sector under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, is that there's a duty upon the employer to take care of employees, and that arises from the common law. However, what we also have, which has now been codified into both acts, is that the employer must take all reasonably practical measures to safeguard not only employees, but also non-employees, which also then factors in and takes into account those contractors and those labor broker employees that I referenced earlier. And what does this reasonable practical measures mean? I can say to you that probably, and I must apologize on behalf of my colleagues in the industry, most of us actually get this wrong. Either we refer to the definition in the Act. The definition is not the be-all and end-all. Our courts sadly haven't had much a chance to sort of deal with it properly, but the British courts thankfully and fortunately have, and our law pretty much aligns with them. They've dealt with this issue and they've basically indicated that reasonable practical measures is not about what is physically possible. So it's not saying, well, as Andrew's indicated, that you can have a lower back issue and maybe there is a possibility we can give you a fancy futuristic exoskeleton in order to avoid that kind of issue. It's not saying that. What it's saying is that there must be a computation that occurs. So you're basically going to say, well, how much is this exoskeleton going to cost? And what is going to be the likelihood or the implications of not having the exoskeleton and actually potentially risking this harm from arising? In the event that the harm is still fairly trivial and the expense is quite high, it's not necessary for the employer to do that. I don't think at this stage in time, most employers need to consider exoskeletons. However, they may need to consider things like, well, are there not other less extensive devices that they might need to think about, like maybe a box to stand up on properly, or a better chair, or maybe a keyboard that's more ergonomic, those things which are the cost is fairly trivial. Then that might become the duty that they do need to provide those kinds of infrastructures, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's better training, whatever the story is. The moment that disease, and the doctor says to us that the disease is potentially going to start becoming fatal or becoming very serious, then the amount of money that is going to be contemplated as being too much becomes less significant. And what I mean by that is, if we know the person's going to potentially die, and the cost of averting that death is going to be considerably quite high and almost eye-opening, it's not going to matter. The employer is going to be obligated to incur that cost anyway. What we need to understand in terms of our law, and this relates to the strict liability issue as well, is in terms of strict liability, when I sue an employer trying to bypass the quota, I always go and say, well, they breached the regulation. Prescribed regulation indicated that they needed to do a particular thing and they didn't do it. We're not going to go into the blame game to say who is responsible and who is not responsible. The point is the regulation was there. If the regulation was complied with, this probably wouldn't have happened. And that's the strict liability thing. So we have to then look at the ergonomics regulations that presently exist under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It indicates more or less there what is the ergonomic thing there. And what I want to make, my point here that I'd like to make, is that the ergonomics definition is exceptionally broad, in fact. And what I would actually suggest that is, even in the event that the emergency regulations that we're all under with quota falls away and all of that stuff disappears because we're no longer under quota, you're probably going to find that all of that stuff actually is going to find application in the ergonomics regulations anyway. An ergonomic safeguard might, before it be, in fact, be these sort of face shields that people have to have between them when you go to Woolworths and you try and pay at the cashier. That might be an ergonomic solution in order to avoid an ergonomic risk, for example. So the regulations are frequently underutilized, and I don't think people actually really realize what's going on there. Further on the point, I mean, what the regulation basically stipulates is that you need to incur what can be described as a Red Queen hypothesis. And what I mean by that is, it's an evolutionary biology term, is that when there's a risk, you need to take certain precautions. You need to do a risk assessment. You need to assess how bad is the risk, what is the actual risk, and what can we actually do to mitigate it or potentially eliminate it. And that goes on. But as technology changes and as circumstances changes, the risk changes. 100 years ago, the risk of inhaling dust wasn't as bad as it is today, because we now have machinery that's able to get the dust much finer. So the risk assessment has to sort of carry on with that. And as a predator evolves in order to find its prey, similarly the prey evolves to be able to outrun the predator. And you have this type of situation here as well, where the risk constantly changes. And because the risk constantly changes because of new technology and new circumstances, you need to always be updating the risk assessment. You need to potentially always be considering what is the current state of the art in order to avoid these kinds of things. You may in fact find that an ergonomic keyboard is now fairly cost effective, and because it's now cost effective, it's not as expensive as it was 20 years ago. It now becomes, within the reasonable practicability duty, it now does become quite necessary in order to implement. When we now move to the mining companies, and what's important to understand is that the regulations under the OSHA are not binding at this point in time under the mines. We then look to the mines, and what the mines have is they've got the guideline for risk-based fatigue management, and that deals with a lot of the ergonomic issues there as well. And there again, you may find, in fact, that there's a lot of parallels that are drawn, although it's structured a little bit differently. And what's important to understand is the mines actually make it quite important that not only do you have to do the risk assessment, but there has to be an ongoing medical surveillance program that needs to also be considering these things. So in addition to the lung functions and the x-rays that they do, they need to also consider the ergonomic aspects and assess whether or not they become something that becomes reportable, such as my electrician that I mentioned earlier this week, who was working in an awkward position. That is in actual fact a reportable medical instance that needs to go to RAND neutral, and they need to assess it. And what's important to understand is that the guidelines for the mining industry have to be complied with by the mines. What I will say to you is that although the regulations under the OSHA, the 2019 regulations, are not binding, The Minister of Minerals may, in fact, make them binding, but even if he doesn't, they still remain persuasive. So if you are in HR, I would suggest that you look at both. And then just ending off, what I just want to point out is, although you have this no-fault liability concept, and I've explained that there are some loopholes to that, even though it's no fault, in the event that the Chief Inspector of Mines or the Medical Inspector of Mines or the Chief Inspector of Labour, depending on the industry that you fall on, finds an actual fact that you were negligent, it may in fact be that the employee is entitled to additional compensation through Section 56 of the COIDA. So you must just also bear that in mind, and that compensation will be indirectly recovered potentially from the employer. So although it's a no-fault liability act, that's the short message. The long message is you need to ensure that you comply with the regulations, and you need to ensure that you don't do anything which is negligent and results in an employee's harm. Okay, the last thing is I just want to point out is relating to the duty of care is the fact that employees also then have a duty to right to refuse dangerous work. It is codified in the Mine Health and Safety Act under Section 23, but that doesn't mean that a non-mine worker doesn't enjoy the same right. It just means that the non-mine worker, a factory worker, an office worker, their right arises from the common law. However, what is important to understand is in order to trigger the right must be objective. That means that it can't be your subjective view that this is going to cause this. It has to be objective, meaning that a doctor or an expert has said this is likely to cause that. The moment there's a professional objective view, that would be sufficient in order to trigger the right. And then an employee, in fact, may refuse to do a certain work that may potentially in time aggravate or cause one of these disorders. And that's also very important to remember and understand that is also a constitutional right. Sorry for going so quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George. There's I think there's quite a few comments there regarding some of the legal requirements and how people can cope with some of the issues that they're experiencing. So if you can start, answering those in the chat. But wow, I think this was quite an enlightening presentation. Thank you so much for that, George. There's a lot that I think a lot of organizations need to do differently based on some of the information that you have provided here. And I would just like to highlight one aspect, the fact that decades even after you've retired, you can always go back and say, well, maybe this case needs to be reconsidered. It means that one of the things that might be reviewed would include things like the risk assessments. And I think it's really, really appropriate that the ergonomics regulations specify that a competent person needs to do these ergonomic risk assessments. Because if it wasn't a competent person who did it, it might have been done wrong. It might not have been comprehensive. You might then find that even the controls that are suggested are actually going to aggravate the issue because of voodoo ergonomics, as we call it in the discipline. So thank you so much, George. You'll join us again when we're doing the discussion. We did run over a little bit with time, but I see people are sticking around. I know we're supposed to end at 12:30, but with your permission, we'll go over maybe by like 5 or 10 minutes. And I would like to now invite Dr. Millicent Tlakula to please start sharing her presentation and opening her camera. And while she does that, I would like to introduce her. So Dr. Millicent Tlakula is a qualified occupational medical practitioner and the CEO of OSHEC Health and Safety Solutions. She has extensive experience and interest in the railway, road transport, engineering, and pharmaceutical sectors within South Africa. In fact, I met her while doing work within the railway sector. That's how I got to meet her. She attained her professional qualifications, which is a Bachelor of Medicine and Surgery in 2000 in Medunsa, a diploma in occupational health in 2004, and a management development program in 2006. She's also done travel medicine at WITS and impairment evaluation as well as at the American Board of Independent Medical Examiners in 2012. She's currently completing a Master in Management of Technology and Innovation with the Da Vinci Institute, and her master study is focused on improving human factors management within the railway and other industries in South Africa. Her vision is to assist workplaces to reduce the mortality and morbidity rates arising out of workplace activities, and as well as promoting health and safety standards and assisting employers in achieving their return on investment. With this vision in mind, over the past 12 years, Dr. Millicent has been delivering various services to the industry through her occupational health consultancy firm, which is OSHIC Health and Safety Solutions. It's an ISO accredited, ISO 9001, as well as the Health and Welfare CETA as well. So included in her services is occupational medicine, health and safety services, COVID-19 management, as well as health and safety training. I think it was really important for this session that I included a medical practitioner who is dealing with the mismanagement of occupational exposures that lead to musculoskeletal disorders. And I think her practical insights will hopefully help those organizations and those professionals who don't yet have a medical surveillance program that integrates, the screening, the identification, diagnosis of musculoskeletal disorders. Over to you, Dr. Millie. We've got just like less time than we had allocated you. So I humbly request, if you can, to please maybe go a little bit faster if it's possible. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Sma, for this invitation. I'm luckily a very fast talker, so we will go quite fast in terms of my presentation. So the discussion points that we'll look into is legislative guidelines for medical surveillance. I think Andrew has George has spoken a lot on that. Diagnosing musculoskeletal disorders, what informs medical surveillance, health risk assessment that should be done, medical surveillance tools, what do we have from a history perspective, what do we have in terms of diagnostic tools, possible diagnosis in terms of what could they be, these musculoskeletal disorders. We'll look into how do we manage it once we know that the person has musculoskeletal disorders from an occupational setting perspective. And then I'll touch a bit on COIDA at the end. So in terms of legislative imperative, we know that medical surveillance is legislated. If there is a hazard at work where workers are exposed to that particular hazard, it is required by law that we do medical surveillance. So from an Act perspective, Occupational Health and Safety Act, Mine Health and Safety Act is the ones that are mandating us to do, medical surveillance at work. When we look into compensation of diseases, if there is a problem, George has spoken, quite a bit in terms of COIDA and what is the place of COIDA in managing musculoskeletal disorders. In terms of Labor Relations Act, it is important because we look into inherent job requirements. So this then helps us when we're doing pre-employments. Can we exclude somebody from doing a particular work because of the inherent job requirements? Employment Equity Act, as we all know it, is about non-discrimination. And from an occupational health perspective or from a medical surveillance perspective, when we look into Employment Equity Act, we look into what is issues of accommodation. Can we be able to accommodate a person? Is it reasonably practicable that the employers can be able to offer accommodations in terms of work? We all know that, all these acts are based on constitutional rights of employees as the bounding act in the country. In terms of philosophy of medical surveillance, like I said, it is legislated, it's the planned program of periodic examination. We may do biological monitoring, clinical examination, we can do questionnaires. So depending on the issue at hand, there's various methods that occupational medical practitioners can use to make sure that medical surveillance are done. Why we do medical surveillance? We want to establish the health status of the employee when they start work. We also do it on exit to establish the health status when they leave work. Have we damaged people in any other way that, when they leave, they're going to suffer in terms of, occupational diseases or even complications from injuries? We also want to establish if there's a need to remove workers from certain environments. We want to ensure that they seek appropriate medical treatment if there is issues that has happened. We also want to start, preventative measures. Medical surveillance is actually part of, the hierarchy of controls in terms of, hazard. We we can put it under administrative controls to say that if there is a problem, how are we going to manage that problem in the workplace? So in terms of diagnosing musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace, it's just like diagnosing any other condition in the workplace. We need to have, or rather in life, we need to ask appropriate questions in terms of having history, doing physical examination, generating, a provisional diagnosis or differential diagnosis, looking into testing, whether we're doing chest x-ray, whether we're doing blood studies, and to reach a final diagnosis. So the difference in a normal practice and in an occupational health setting is that from a medical surveillance perspective, we need to always anticipate. In occupational health, we need to anticipate, is a problem going to happen? Are we going to have a musculoskeletal disorder? We need to actively search for the possibility of a musculoskeletal disorder. We need to put mitigating factors in place to avoid any musculoskeletal disorder in place. So how we do it, number one, it will be through what we call a walkabout. So we do a walkabout to scan the environment to see if we've got conditions that can allow musculoskeletal disorders to happen. Example would be fixed or constrained work positions, continual, repetitive movements, force that is exerted in certain parts of the body, the pace of work that is too fast, that is not allowing recovery. And in order for us to manage this in the workplace, we work with obviously SHE practitioners to look, can we eliminate the work that is causing, a fixed or a constrained position? Can we substitute that work? Can we have engineering controls in place? We've already spoken, I think George spoke a bit about, and even Andrew, about, ergonomic chairs, changing job designs. Are we able to put those things in place? From an administrative perspective, can we look into things like safe working procedure before we move to PPE? So those are the questions that we need to have, because the aim of medical surveillance is, much as we're actively looking for something, we also want to assist the employer that at the end of the day, people are not leaving work in a worse off position. People are not becoming sick because of their occupation. So that's the ultimate aim of medical surveillance. So in terms of risk assessment for musculoskeletal disorder, it has to be deliberate. The examples at hand is that when you're looking into a task, you need to look into, or into a job category, look into all tasks that are associated with the job category. The example that is being obviously presented here is an example of people who are working in a timber industry. Number one, they start by lifting the timber from the ground. When they lift the timber from the ground, they need to bend, twist positions. This is an awkward position. It can lead to lower back pain. You are able to carry the timber into a saw table. There's also, musculoskeletal conditions that can happen. Pulling and pushing in terms of, putting it onto the saw table and ultimately cutting it. So certain things can happen. Other examples that we can look into practically is maybe the issue of painting. When somebody paints, they need to lift their hands above the head. So basically, they're lifting the brush above their head. That's the problematic work-related activity. In terms of a risk, it's an awkward position. What could go wrong? Shoulders could be affected, the shoulder joint. What is the specific musculoskeletal disorder that can arise out of that? Is something like, thoracic outlet syndrome. So the aim of this slide is to show us that we need to do a deliberate health risk assessment as occupational medical practitioners to look for the possibility, to name the possibility, so that we are able to actively look for that and actively manage that. Once we know what we found in terms of medical surveillance, it's about preparing assessment tools, history-taking templates. Do we have enough? To rule out other factors. I mean, the issue of ruling out other factors, it's the one that practically happens in industry, that once, you lift your hand up and say that I've got a possible musculoskeletal disorder, the employer will ask, were there any inherent conditions that this person had? Are there genetic conditions? An example could be somebody with arthritis at work. If the person has arthritis, based on the type of work that they do, the other question that can come is that what type of, could this have been a rheumatoid arthritis? So are you able to do rheumatoid factor to rule out, other forms of arthritis? We also need to rule out other forms of work, because a person could be doing some form of sedentary work at home or rather sedentary work at work. And when they get home, they're having hobbies that are leading to a musculoskeletal disorder. Musculoskeletal questionnaires, we've got different types. Absenteeism records are other important form of surveillance where we can get information in terms of, possible musculoskeletal disorder in companies. The current problem with it is that most medical practitioners will write that people are having medical conditions without necessarily stating whether it's musculoskeletal, whether it's a cardiovascular issue, and data can be lost in that space. Assessment tools that we need to have in place to measure, the joints that have been affected, the severity of the joint affectations. We need to have referral network in place, orthopedic specialists, radiological exams if we need x-rays, physio, OT. We refer a lot to National Institute of Occupational Health within South African space for them to verify certain things for us, because sometimes as an occupational medical practitioner, you are torn between the employee and the employer, and at all times you need to do the right things for both parties. The other issues at hand is that when we start medical surveillance, we need to also ask ourselves, do we have a accommodation policy in place? What if, the finding is such that the employee is not disabled enough to be sent home or to even, follow the corridor space, but they are affected in such a way that they need to change their job, description? Do we have those policies in place? In terms of SHE management, do we discuss, incidences that we're finding so many people with lower back pain, so many people with tenosynovitis? Are we discussing those issues or picking them up? So those are the tools, or rather assessment tools, that we need to have in place while we're dealing with, musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace. In terms of history taking, it has to be specific. Are there aches, pains, stiffness, burning sensation? Age factor can play a role. How old is this person? Issues of gender can play a role. There's certain gender roles in industry that the same type of job, a person can be called a butcher, but this butcher, from a male perspective, they're dealing with heavier, maybe carcasses, and female counterparts are doing a lighter job, maybe let's say cutting chicken, but ultimately they're both called, butchers. So we need to look into those things. Are there gender roles that we are putting to jobs that we can see particular people, particular gender being more affected, compared to the other gender? So those are important things that we need to look into. This is an example of a musculoskeletal questionnaire. There's a lot of them that are available on the net, and the variety of them. The important thing in terms of choosing a tool, we need to know that it's a tool that can be understood. So the subjects that you're using the tool on, they need to understand the tool. From a practitioner perspective, we need to ensure that the tools are specific and sensitive enough to pick up what we want to pick up. We need to also, when we're using a tool, we need to consider other things. What do I call pain? Somebody can call pain a discomfort, while another person can obviously call it pain based on the tolerance. So those are important nuances from a history perspective that we need to understand, that the perception of pain is different for different people. So, for example, an African person can say that, after Caesar, I need to get used, after doing a cesarean section, I need to get used to the pain. There's nothing, I don't need to take pain relief. Somebody, because of their socialization, and I'm going to the psychosocial factors that Andrew spoke about, can, for any amount of pain, even the smallest that the other person can view as the smallest based on their socialization, might exaggerate the pain. So it's important to also understand, the person in front of you that you're surveilling, how do they perceive pain, so that you don't underestimate, what could be the biggest problem, or even, downplay what could be, the biggest problem. So in terms of musculoskeletal disorders that, could be there in the workplace, SMA has already spoken that whether it's disease of the nerves, tendons, tendon sheath, muscles, discs, blood vessels, ligaments, bones, we could have a variety of them. An example that I gave is an issue about a painter who can have a thoracic syndrome, tennis elbow, people who are doing repetitive motion, butchers, people who are carpenters, de Quervain syndrome, people who are counting coins, or tennis players, or golfers. So it's important to have an idea in terms of a differential diagnosis. What am I dealing with? Because ultimately, when we go to COIDA, if we want to claim for this for any employee who's being affected from work, diagnosis will play a role. So we need to follow steps in ensuring that we diagnose musculoskeletal disorders properly and we name them. So it cannot just be a soft tissue disorder. It cannot just be a sprain. So we need to name them properly so that we are able to assist, employees in the COIDA claims. In terms of exam, it has to be targeted examination. Health risk assessment would have guided us to say that these are the possibilities. History would have guided us because we would have excluded other forms of diseases that could lead to the same things. We do normal inspection, palpation, range of motion, which can help in terms of, measuring the calculation of the impairment, because if you've got certain amount of, range of motion, this can lead to a particular degree in terms of impairment or loss of function of a particular tissue. Muscle testing techniques, there's a lot of provocation tests that we use as, health practitioners to check or to counter check what the subject in front of us, the employee, is saying, and if this is a subjective or objective. So there's objective tests that can be done in terms of diagnosing musculoskeletal disorders. So how do we manage musculoskeletals? Once we know that, we have a musculoskeletal disorder, we need to ask ourselves, is this employee still fit for work? If the employee is not fit for work, what is available for them? Are they going through a COIDA process plus also insurer process? What work has the employee been doing and for how long? Have all risk activities been assessed properly? Have we chosen the most effective and reliable controls? I spoke about hierarchy of control before to say that if we've got a hierarchy of control, we need to check, have we eliminated, substituted engineering controls, changed the job design properly? Is the employee trained? Because that's another part in terms of, administrative controls. Have we trained people to do the work properly? Have we maintained and checked that the controls that we've put in place are working and are effective? Is there necessary PPE that could be used? Can the employee be accommodated? If so, does it change the salary? What does it do? What is the accommodation policy within the company? Does the case qualify for compensation? We also need to look into other organizational factors that Andrew has alluded to, things like, shift work pattern. Are we allowing enough rest? What is our SHE management procedure in terms of, managing musculoskeletal disorders? So if there's anything that is compensable, George has already mentioned, I think that's my last slide in terms of what could be compensable. So the law is quite clear. Anything that falls under Schedule 3, if I'm exposed to noise at work, I've got noise-induced hearing loss, I cannot argue. If I've got any of the stated musculoskeletal disorder under Table 3, and it can be proven, diagnosis is there, the type of work that I can do can lead to that, it is compensable. So it's something that we need to have awareness of as occupational medical practitioner and SHE practitioners and HR and whoever that is available within the webinar, that is something that we need to actively look for, and it's something that we need to call it by name and follow due processes in terms of managing it. So the biggest dilemma in industry comes in the cost, the burden of proof. That is the burden of proof on the employee or the employer. So when you're doing certain form of testing, whether you're doing genetic testing, whether you're doing, the RH factor that I spoke about to rule out blood studies, to rule out rheumatoid arthritis, who bears the cost of that? And that's the biggest debate that we normally have. And I'm hoping through these discussions that we're having, with other panel experts, that we can know who has to bear the cost, because that's the biggest struggle. That as occupational medical practitioners, we might be willing to go a particular way, or we are obliged to go the particular way, but the cost factor sometimes plays a role in, finalizing the case at hand and allowing the employee to get benefits from COIDA. Thank you so much. Sma, I think I tried my best to rush through what I have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Millie. Thank you. Another really excellent presentation. Thank you so much for that. I think the audience will agree with me that the panel that we put together has just been exceptional. I think there are a lot of questions that people already have asked and will probably have moving forward. So please just remember to fill out the evaluation form, and you must tell us what other information you would like us to organize webinars for, so that we can try and meet those requirements. There's been quite a few questions as well regarding, will we be sharing the recording? Yes, it's being recorded, and we will share the recording with everyone. And also just a note to the SIOSH members that you can claim 1 CPD point for attending this webinar. But at this point, we're just going to move very quickly into the merge discussion Q&A session. And I would like to invite my panelists to please turn your cameras on. And then when we ask a question and you would like to answer, you can then turn your mic on. So there have been quite a few questions. Some have been asked privately, some on the chat. So we're just going to try and go through most of the questions as possible. We have reached 12:30, so I apologize for going over time, but I think most of you have stayed on, which means that this is riveting material. So thank you for staying on. All right, we're going to start maybe with one of the questions that was asked. Let me go. Who do we start with? I think one of the questions that was asked, by I think a few people was regarding what happens if there's a case, but the doctors, don't want to fill out the correct documentation, or they don't want to do whatever, follow the process to reopen certain cases. I don't know if maybe Dr. Millie will answer that, or if George would like to answer that, but between the two of you, please, can you handle that question?
My take is that, and I think that's the dilemma that we have in industry, George, that, most medical practitioners are fed by the employers. So it becomes a tricky one, to go against what the employer, but the important thing is that we need to always remember that we are independent practitioners and we stand by our practice numbers, and we need to follow the letter of the law. So, consequences that could be there, it's obviously reporting to HPCSA, it's, reporting the case to the lawyers, and it's something that obviously any medical practitioner does not wish, for themselves. So I think I want to urge my fellow colleagues that what is important is that we need to be fair and follow the letter of the law always. It's the guiding principle, and it's about integrity at the end of the day, that do what is right, we don't decide. Like from an act perspective, you cannot decide as an occupational medical practitioner if the case is compensable or not. Your role is to apply for compensation and leave it to the COIDA or to RMA or to FEMA, whatever body that is there, to decide, if the case is compensable or not.
Okay, I think that's a comprehensive answer. I don't know if you want to add anything there, George, or we can take another question.
Sure. I just wanted to say that in terms of reopening, it's under Section 90 of the COIDA, and you don't have to go to your old work mind doctor or whoever it might be to do it. You can go to any specialist or subspecialist that deals with the thing. They can actually complete the forms to reopen the case. In the event that the Compensation Commission or RAND Mutual still declines to reopen it, you then have to file an objection under Section 91 against that decision, and the doctor would have to come and potentially testify and motivate why they should reconsider it.
Okay, thank you for that. Just as a reminder, there's one last poll on your chats. Please, can you vote for that? We are asking you because a lot of you have indicated that you are already experiencing some of these musculoskeletal disorder symptoms. Tell us how you're currently handling them. And we'll have a question which we will link back to Andrew a little bit later. So please vote while we ask the next question. And the next question, and I think we had a poll earlier where we were asking people if they are currently reporting some of these symptoms to their employers. And I think we had 40% saying they don't even think it's a reportable issue, and therefore they have not reported it. We had a question here from, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Kati Kasen Moodley, who says, will any proof be required for reporting of that work-related injury to the employer by the employee? So yes, now people are saying, well, I've got these symptoms and I want to report. So how do I report? Do I need any evidence? What would normally need to happen? And anyone can take that, anyone who's able to answer.
Doc, could I maybe take this one? What I would suggest and what I would propose is, look, it's not a subjective thing. So you might decide that you've got a particular disorder. A doctor, I think, needs to basically indicate that you have a particular medical condition. That medical condition needs to be reported to the employer, and the employer also has an interest in identifying medical conditions, because if these conditions are occurring, that means that they need to update their risk assessment. All employers have to go through a risk assessment investigation when one of these occurs, and then they need to then also potentially report it. Okay, so in the event that they have for example, you're a mine worker, as the doctor pointed out, and you've got hearing loss, and you work underground with the drills, that has to be reported automatically. Even if the employer is adamant that it's not compensatable, it must be reported. The decision doesn't rest with them. There's a presumption in favor of the employee that it is occupational. That does not mean, however, that the employer can't go and then argue why it's not. They can submit forms and they can say, well, in this particular case, yes, this guy worked underground, but he's also fascinated by heavy metal music and motorcycles, and that's probably more the reason. So it's not irrebuttable presumption. They can rebut it, but we presume that the A causes B unless additional evidence shows, well, not in this case.
Okay, and I think that's important to note, because I think in a lot of cases that I've encountered anyway, people say, well, you've reported it. How do we know? Do you have a ruptured disc? Does the imaging indicate that you even have lower back pain, for example? They want to see the extreme cases of musculoskeletal disorders in a lot of organizations before they will believe workers who are reporting that they're experiencing this pain. Maybe, Doctor, if you can maybe give us some insights into that, especially when it comes to instances where people are not at the extreme end of, physical, damage. How would one look at that case?
So, Sma, what is important is that for anyone to report a case, an employer's report of an accident or of an injury has to be completed off, or employer's report of an occupational disease. So that has to be completed by the employer. So, and I think most of the time that's where this argument starts, because the employer might say that you did not get this in your employ. And there's a question that is specific there to say that did this person get injured while doing their own duties? So employers have a space there, as George has alluded to, say that yes or no. Then they can give their own reasons. But the important thing is that it must be submitted. The compensation commissioner will take will be the final arbiter on the matter. With the question that you're asking, even with musculoskeletal disorder, a diagnosis has to be made. So we're not talking about the grading of the diagnosis. So you could have, thoracic outlet syndrome grade 1, that you're not showing worse effects. It's not necessarily grade 4 that will not show. So a diagnosis by a medical practitioner, so you can't diagnose yourself and then want to report for yourself. There has to be a medical practitioner coming in and calling it by name and saying that my objective assessment has been 1, 2, 3, 4. Whether it was in the rooms, that was done, whether there was proof, because not all, diseases will show on X-ray. Not everything will show on sonar. But, that medical practitioner will be standing by the practice number to say that when I did my provocation test, this is what I found. It's something that can be verifiable by another independent practitioner, should, that be required.
All right. Thank you for that. And I think, when we look at the roles and responsibilities of employers and employees, one of them is that employees need to report if there are any issues in terms of the occupational exposures. So those who are currently not reporting, please, take your employers into your confidence so that they can know that there might be some issues there. But also now the other question which came up a few times relates to the issue of how does an employer know if it was risks from the work setting versus those from outside of the work environment, so non-work related risk factors? And I think that also comes in, it touches on other factors, such as when organizations are onboarding people, are they even checking if they're not inheriting people who already have some of these musculoskeletal issues? When things are changing in people's lives and they might be exposed to other risks, non-work related factors, we know for a fact that they will influence what happens to people when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders. And I think George already touched on that, but maybe you might want to explain a little bit further there, because I think Sizwe also asked, in terms of the evidence, Sizwe Butilezi asked in terms of, the evidence or tracking information about when people are developing these musculoskeletal disorders over time. So maybe you can just comment a little bit around those issues, George.
Sure. What basically happens is if you are an HR, you're the employer, whoever you might be with the company, and you receive a doctor's letter, whether it's a GP or a specialist, that basically hints that this might be related to work. They don't have to say it conclusively. Is the moment they suggest it, it's hinted, they must report it. It's not for them to say, well, this is definitely not us. and this guy listens to heavy metal music, and the hearing is because of that. Hearing loss is because of that. It's not for them. They can try and argue it later down the line. What is important to understand is that this is also, it's a non-fault system, essentially. So if you inherit someone, and I had a case where a guy got mesotherma while he was working at a new employee. He had just started there, and the mesotherma, the asbestos fiber that he must have inhaled, came from an employer 20 years before. Okay, it's not saying by submitting the report that my worker has got an occupational disease that you are saying I am responsible for it. You're simply reporting it as part of the process. It's not a blame game. Your duty, however, as the current employer, is that you have to report it. You can't say, well, no, the old employer must report it. We don't get into that debate.
Yes.
The current employer is the one that must report it. End of story.
Thank you for clarifying that. And at this point, I would like to bring in Andrew. And there's a question here from Max Hutchinson. And he says, what effects do extramural and non-work activities and lifestyle have on the incidence of musculoskeletal disorders? So Andrew took us through, the different causal factors. And I think you'd probably be the best person to answer this question here. So the impact of extramural and not work related activities and lifestyle on the development of musculoskeletal disorders.
Well, I think the mechanism is exactly the same. And so the mechanism doesn't change. No, it's all about managing that relationship between the workload and the tolerance limits, etc. So extramural activities can have a very beneficial impact on the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders. So, it's not as simple as you doing extramural activities that it contributes to musculoskeletal disorders. Through that mechanism that I was showing of adaptation, in fact, being involved in extramural activities can have a preventative mechanism. If it is associated with the appropriate rest, recovery, sleep, so all of those factors become really important when, it's why there is now this emphasis on taking a holistic, integrated approach to understanding the development of musculoskeletal disorders. But otherwise, if you work in construction and you're doing construction at home without adequate rest, then it can have a negative impact on the development of musculoskeletal disorders.
For sure.
But I think George and Millie actually both did address this in some regards earlier, though, in terms of if there is exposure to that risk at work, it's up to the employer to show that it hasn't contributed to the development, regardless of whether there is activities outside that may also be contributing to it. So again, it is about, as employers, working with employees to understand the appropriate balance and emphasis on a holistic understanding and appropriate rest, appropriate recuperation, etc.
All right. And I think that also touches on the importance of actually training people, making them aware of some of the issues around musculoskeletal disorders, the causal factors, what's the most appropriate way to mitigate, the effects once you do experience them. And I'd like just to divert our attention now to the poll results. We asked the question of people on the audience, which strategies do you mostly use to manage pain, discomfort, aches, and swelling in different parts of your body? There's 30% of you who say you take over-the-counter medication. So opioid use is, we've just dropped Dr. Millie. Maybe she'll be able to join in a bit. So people are using pain medication over-the-counter to manage this. 12% are being prescribed pain medication by their doctors, and that's what they are doing. And 26% say that they exercise and or stretch. Some of you are saying that you will use different ways maybe of supporting your posture, or so for example, if you're sitting in an office, you're going to start using like cushions or whatever the case is. And 9% are saying that you rearrange your workstations. I'd like to go back to Andrew and linking this to the causal factors. If you look at how people are currently dealing with the effects of musculoskeletal disorders, what would your comment be regarding this, and particularly highlighting the issue of people taking pain medication or opioids?
Yeah, I think you summarized it really nicely there. And again, it goes back to if we're not resting appropriately, and there's some beautiful statistics coming out with the relationship between sleep and musculoskeletal disorders in a variety of different ages, as an example. And inadequate sleep results in inflammation, which results in pain. And in fact, some of this latest stuff coming out on understanding lower back pain is actually relating far more to not just intervertebral discs, but relating to pain perception. And very interesting data starting to show that pain perception goes first. And one of the risks we are running then that what actually starts to happen is there's an increase in blood supply to avascular areas, in other words, to areas that don't normally have blood supply, increase in nerve innervation. And so actually there is pain, even when perhaps the tolerance of those particular tissues is not being negatively impacted, but there is pain. And so, yes, the use of just over-counter medication, I think Millie's probably better qualified to speak on that as the OP. Clearly, we need to be doing, and I'm glad there was at least, what was it, around 26 saying that they exercise and or stretch, which is important. But again, that holistic understanding of the factors that lead to recovery, including proper nutrition, including proper sleep, proper rest, are absolutely vital for the recovery from these particular activities.
Thank you. Okay, we're just going to start wrapping up. I'm sorry to those who we have not been able to answer the questions that you have posed. I'll just ask the panelists to maybe answer some of them on the chat for 5 minutes after we end the webinar. But I think maybe just to end off, I just want to show everyone some of the evidence that is out there when it comes to the management of musculoskeletal disorders, as well as, using ergonomics programs as one of the ways in which we can, within organizations, manage some of these risks. So this slide here is basically showing us some of the evidence that was published, which shows that organizations that had implemented ergonomics programs, so they took this case studies from like 114 organizations that had implemented ergonomics programs, which included, interventions for managing some of these risk exposures. And they found things such as, a 57% reduction in the number of work-related musculoskeletal disorders, and the incidence rates went down by 57% as well. Lost work days went down by 72%. Compensation costs went down, by 67%. So by implementing ergonomics programs, implementing ergonomics interventions to deal with some of these musculoskeletal related risk factors, there's evidence that, companies have been able to improve the return on investment of even investing in some of these ergonomics interventions. So I think what's important is just to highlight the fact that there are obviously other benefits, but because we're focusing mainly on musculoskeletal disorders, that's what we're mainly going to be focusing on. And then also just to reiterate, the fact that the earlier on that you implement ergonomics, the cheaper it is and the more issues you can avoid in the later stage. So a lot of organizations are already not implementing ergonomics, and therefore they're probably finding that they have these musculoskeletal disorders being an issue. And so the next best time for them to implement ergonomics is from today, from the time that they find out that it's a requirement and that it can actually benefit their health and safety programs, as well as their productivity and quality of output. And I think just to conclude with the webinar is that we know from a legislative perspective that it's mandatory, but I think it should go beyond the fact that it's a legislative imperative, but organizations should realize that it's currently costing them a lot of money, a lot of time lost by not managing ergonomic risks that lead to musculoskeletal disorders. And so some of the proposed solutions are that please ensure that you're doing training and awareness so that people understand what are the issues. Do these gap analysis so you can understand what needs to be done to alleviate these issues. Do the risk assessments, make sure it's a competent person who is doing them, and then develop these ergonomics programs, implement them so that you can be able to address some of these issues that we are seeing. Just from the polls that we did here, we realized that people are experiencing issues, but I do not think a lot is being done to address these directly. And so the hope behind this webinar is that we have informed people, we've made people aware of some of the issues that are at play, and that you can go back and act on this, go back and report, go back and review your risk assessments, go back and go to your company and tell them what they need to do differently so that you can avoid some of these issues that we have pointed out. But we will end the session here for now. I would really, really like to thank our panelists who have willingly given their time, shared their expertise, shared their practical experience in dealing with these issues of musculoskeletal disorders. And I think the session was really, really well presented by all of them, and really just from the bottom of my heart, from myself and Smart Ergonomics, we'd like to say thank you, thank you, thank you. And to the people who have the audience members, please, thank you also to you for attending. Thank you for interacting. We have an evaluation form that is available on the sticky note. I'm just going to put it in the chat now as well. Please, can you complete that so that we can get feedback from you to improve these in the future, but also so we know what else you want to hear about, and then we can try and work our magic and bring those sessions to you. Remember, CPD points for SIOS registered members, 1 CPD point. And besides that, thank you so much for joining us. We will stay behind in the chat so that if you have additional questions, just for 5 minutes, we'll be able to answer those. Otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers for now.
Thanks.